Hi, everybody. I am really excited to be here and talking with you all today. I think this is a pretty big departure from where we've been, but I'm excited about where we get to go in talking about including equity in tech work. So it's not really a secret. We've got some big problems with equity and inclusion in tech. So this picture was taken in 1955. It's of the ENIAC, and we've got Betty Snyder and Glenn Beck in this picture. And 55 years ago was a long time, right? We should be way farther from this era of computing in the social side of things than we are right now. But unfortunately, we just haven't come as far as we should have. So literally yesterday, Twitter released a new policy on dehumanizing speech. So if you were to be harassed or trolled on Twitter up until the end of this year, and you report somebody, it's really just looking for any violations of their terms of service, and that doesn't include harassing language if it doesn't also include a physical threat of violence, like a rape threat or a death threat. That did not come out easily. So for a lot of us who have experienced harassment online, it's like, yay, they're doing something, finally. After years of waiting. Yesterday, this got announced. The problem is so bad, we've made Ad Week. You know, that seems like a weird fit, but I'm sure many people in this room remember the 2016 Tay dilemma when Microsoft's chatbot got racist, misogynistic, and anti-Semitic all in 24 hours flat. You know, go team. Okay. 2015 incident, Google Photos tags black people as gorillas and puts pictures in a special folder. This was awful. And just earlier this year, we revisited it to find out that they've fixed this problem by just taking primates and gorillas out of the system entirely. So, you know, that's one way to handle this. I don't think that's fixing the underlying social issues. I would hope that most of you would agree with that statement. But fixing the underlying social issues, addressing them in tech, that's really thorny. It's really, really complicated. Again, this year, Algorithms of Oppression came out. Are people aware of this book? It's a fabulous book by a professor at USC, Safiya Umoja Noble. And she is in the it's there somewhere, but she's at USC. I apparently forgot which school to put in my notes, but in this book, she is looking at the relationships between algorithms and how they reinforce and spread existing social inequalities. And particularly, she looks at the relationship between the Google search engine and black women of color more broadly. And part of the inspiration for this book started when she was looking for ideas to share with her nieces, and she Googled the term black girls, and the first link was very pornographic. That just seems like it shouldn't be that way. And since writing this book and working with Google, things have changed a bit, but the underlying issues still exist. We've got some problems in tech, some really thorny social problems that we don't have good strategies of dealing with right now. So my hope is that everyone in this room is interested in doing more and doing better. But we get stuck. What does it mean to do more, to do better? How can we address these thorny social problems when we're worried about bugs, and did we remember the curly bracket? And there's just a lot of things to juggle when you are sitting at your desk and programming. So the goal here is to, as a group, own up to some of the problems that we are actively contributing to in the tech industry, whether we are intending to or not, and to look to papers as a guide, as a beacon of hope, to help us figure out how do we move forward from here, and how do we do it a little better. So we're going to go back to the dawn of time. We're going to start all over, right? So hello, world. Well, not the dawn of time today, but we're going to go back to the beginning of Unix. And specifically, we're going to look at a paper, this is a book chapter, that links the origins of Unix, so some pretty fundamental operating system philosophies, and race, and the logics around race in the US at the mid-century, so 1960s, and after that as well. So this is a paper by Tara McPherson. Tara McPherson is a chair also at USC. There's a lot of really interesting people who come out of USC in this digital humanities space. And this talk, this paper that we're going to delve into is not originating from a computer science field. So part of what I love about computer science and HCI, my area, is that it's interdisciplinary. There's an opportunity to pull in from all these different places and get inspired and work with information sciences, media studies, cultural studies, American studies, critical race theory, all sorts of good stuff. But there might be some very new material for you in here, and I've done my best to scaffold it, but I'm always happy to answer questions if you have any. So this chapter is in a book called Race After the Internet, and without further ado, it's a 2012 publication as well, but anyways, let's dig in. So I figured the best way to set up this book chapter was with a quote from McPherson, reflecting back on it in a 2015 interview. So McPherson says, "The introduction of computer operating systems at mid-century installed an extreme logic of modularity and seriality that black-boxed knowledge in a manner quite similar to emerging logics of racial visibility and racism at the time." So if there's some stuff you're not following there, no worries, we're going to unpack that as we go through the next couple of slides. So before we get any further, we should talk about talking about race. Because for some people in this room, they have always been aware of race and racism in their lives. There's just no other option. But for other people, this might be one of the first times you're really thinking about race, racism, particularly race and racism in the tech industry, and how all these pieces fit together. And so if this is something you're interested in, this book is fabulous. So you want to talk about race by Ejima Oluo. She is really just great at writing about this and making it accessible, so I highly recommend it. But for us today, the thing to remember is that it isn't a small or easy thing to have these conversations, especially in a big room like this. And so I'm just asking that we stay open, because if we want to do better and think about including equity in tech work, we have to be open to having conversations about identity, about race, and open to change and growing from these conversations. We really especially need to be listening to the people who are experiencing these problems themselves. We need to be listening to people of color, and we need to be listening to people who are experiencing racism day in, day out. So with that stated, let's jump into the way this paper starts, which is juxtaposing two different histories in the US in the mid-1960s. We've got a history of computing and a history of social change. So on the computing side, we've got 1965 as the start. I am aware that there is no scale in this timeline. Please forgive me. It worked out for spacing of the content, which seemed more important. OK, so Multics, which stands for Multiplexed Information and Computer Service. It was a very influential early mainframe time-sharing operating system. And critically, it seeds some of the early ideas of modularity, and it's really influential to Unix, which, when they stopped using Multics at Bell Labs in 1969, they start developing Unix. Particularly Ken Thompson and then Dennis Ritchie are beginning to work on Unix, and eventually that work results in a Turing Award. So got a reference to some Turing Award winners in this paper too, this talk. So that's sort of the mid-century in computing history. On the other side, we've got US social change. In 1965, we've got the assassination of Malcolm X. We've got the Voting Rights Act. We've got the United Farm Workers being established, huge union. 1968, the assassination of MLK, the Stonewall riots, the American Indian movement. So AIM is established. These are some major cultural milestones in this country. And abroad, big things were happening in the 60s as well. We're continuing the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In the late 60s, 32 countries on the African continent gained independence from colonial rulers. Right, times are changing. The Black Panthers were founded in 1966. A lot is going on. And it's interesting to see these two timelines together because typically we're siloed. These histories are sort of modular. We don't think about them in the ways they might be interacting, in the ways they influence each other, but history is overlapped, right? These things were happening at the same time. People acting in this moment, no matter where they fall on a political spectrum, were influenced by the world they were living in, by the changes that were happening. And so what Tara McPherson does is she puts these two things into conversation with each other and looks at how the larger ideologies shaping thought at the time are connected across them. So these two lineages are interconnected. And if it doesn't seem like it yet, we're going to get into the details about how she brings them together. But importantly, they both are shaping thought and knowledge in the US in the 1960s. And they're both doing it in some very similar particular ways. So McPherson says they're both existing as an operating system of sorts, right? So you've got two slices of history. The development of dominant computing philosophies and major cultural and global philosophies are changing as well, cultural in the US. And so one way to think about operating systems here is to think about them as a unifying framework for organizing, managing, and prioritizing things. There's a lot of control on input and output, both on the computing side and on the social change side. So one of the things these two operating systems have in common in the mid-century is modularity, right? So built on this idea of discrete things, objects, if you will, that can be put together and taken apart and deleted and added and changed with no impact on the rest of the system. If it is well done and it is thoroughly modular, shouldn't matter. And it seems sort of obvious for the Unix stuff, right? But McPherson does a really good job of arguing how it's also operating in the way that the US is thinking about acting on and operating within racial logics at this particular moment in history. So this knowledge system of modularity, a place for everything and everything in its place, has some very, very widespread consequences, right? Modularity becomes known as good design. So let's start with the stuff I think we are all sort of on top of, which is Unix. I think it'll be easier to go from there and then jump to the other way. So everybody here knows Unix, yeah? Yeah, okay. So it's a powerful idea. There's a whole philosophy that comes out of it. Not every computing concept ends up with a philosophy that people associate it with it. So that's huge. And modularity is a big part of that. And so you can't really do too much with modularity without at least pointing to Parnasse and this paper on the criteria to be used in decomposing systems into modules. So we're making this a concrete ideology here. We're laying down the terms and solidifying movements that were sort of already underway in computing, right? Setting a foundation for ideas like high cohesion and loose coupling. And this paper is 1972. And so in the McPherson's book chapter, she goes farther into depth on some of the details of the Unix system, but I'm going to leave that out because I think that if you're interested, you should totally go read it. It's exciting, and I'll send it to you. You just have to message me. So McPherson then turns to the 2004 tome, The Art of Unix Programming by Eric Raymond, a famous software engineer, open source software evangelist, who's famous for the publications under the title The Cathedral and the Bazaar, if anyone is familiar with those. And McPherson points out to the first 9 rules of Unix that are published right early up in the book on page 13. And the very first of these rules is the rule of modularity, right? So I don't think I have to convince you that modularity is an important part of the Unix system, but if you look back through the texts that we write and the stories that we tell about these fields, you can see that it's in that history too. It's written down, not just lived in our lives. So we've also got the rule of clarity, the rule of composition, the rule of separation, et cetera, but we're gonna focus in here on modularity. So to be clear, McPherson is not critiquing modularity in terms of its usefulness in a computing context, right? There's no doubt that it is helpful, right? Minimizing complexity and keeping things discrete so that you can identify and isolate problems, so that you can work on one thing at a time, so you don't have to juggle everything in your head all at once is hugely wonderful when you are programming. But this type of logic, this operating system, underscores a whole worldview. And part of that worldview is that when something is troublesome, it's modular, it's removable, it's not connected to everything else, you can just get rid of it. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we talk through some of the rest of this. So I didn't have to convince you, but there it is. Modularity is foundational in Unix. So if we move on to race, I think it's probably, particularly from the backgrounds in this room, not as clear how this happens. So before we get into the particularities with modularity and race in the 1960s in the US, I want to just give a brief background on some of the scholars that McPherson is pulling from. So she's pulling from Omni and Wynett, who are sociologists predominantly by trade, and they're famous for the racial formation theory, which you are welcome to dig deeper into if you are interested. And Omni and Wynett argue that racial foundations serve as a fundamental organizing principles of social relations in the United States. So these are we're talking about really big ideas about who we know, how we know, who do we talk to, how do we talk to people, how do we interact with people, how do we judge people, is it instant, implicit, is it explicit? So there's a lot going on here, and during this mid-century moment, we are moving from the Jim Crow era to the colorblind era, where people are pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps on the merit of who they are and how they are, rather than the histories that follow them around. So we get race-blind and colorblind rhetoric emerging at this time. And so McPherson is stating that the push towards modularity and the covert in digital, sorry, I'm struggling over my own words here, or her words, but the push towards modularity and the covert in digital computation also reflects changes in organizing social life in the 1960s, right? So we were talking earlier about the assassination of Malcolm X and of MLK. We have the Voting Act and the Civil Rights Act, the second one. These are big social change moments, and race is a really critical part of all of them. And so when we tie operating systems to these, we get organizing logics of thought, belief, and action. So McPherson says in the first half of the 20th century, laid bare its racial logics, things like whites-only signs in the South, Jim Crow laws. In the second half, it increasingly hides its racial kernel. So there's an intentional word choice there, right? The core, most basic level operating systems, some things that are invisible to so many of us if we are not actively involved in pulling them apart and understanding them. So you might think that that was then, this is now, but McPherson also takes us to segregation as a way to demonstrate how these logics are, the logics of modularity don't just pop up in our racial understandings at the mid-century, but they continue to make an impact. So this up on the slide is a pretty up-to-date map of segregation in the Chicago metro area. We've got blue dots representing black communities, red represents white, and yellow represents Latinx communities. And following the Civil Rights Act, 64, and the Voting Act in 65, and the Civil Rights Movement, we've got race on the forefront of our minds. We've overcome, as sort of a lot of us are taught in elementary school and middle school, high school in the United States. Yet, following these movements, segregation in many urban areas became worse, or it didn't improve. I mean, look at Chicago. That's very segregated. And so Ms. McPherson places the idea of segregation into relationship with modularity. She is talking about how there's a different inflection when you think about modularity in segregation, that there are easily removable or containable troubling pieces, that you can sort of relegate people to the crumbling urban centers and leave them. And you don't have to think about it in terms of the rest of your life. You don't have to live that life. You don't have to walk through that part of town. There was that app somebody made about avoiding sketchy neighborhoods. Do people remember that? So modularity is a part of the way that we construct and think through and talk about race with the turn of the, not the turn of the century, but in the mid-century. Keep wanting to say turn. So, okay, we've talked about Unix and modularity. We've talked about race and modularity. Let's bring these two systems back into view together, because one of the things about modularity is that they're discrete. It's really hard to, it's like foundationally pushing against this idea of looking at these pieces together. So McPherson says that modularity in software design was meant to decrease global complexity and cleanly separate one neighbor, that's a typo on my part, not in the actual quote, one neighbor from another, and that's from Raymond, which, when put in juxtaposition with segregation, is striking. At least I find it striking. And so these strategies also played out in the ongoing reorganization of the political field throughout the 60s and 70s. It played out in the way that we think about race, and we think about identity in this country. So, okay, how are we doing? Yeah? Okay, cool. Figured I'd check in, going, it's a lot of material. So, okay, so coming from this interdisciplinary space, looking at media studies, cultural studies, et cetera, computers aren't just fancy calculators. Not that they're fancy calculators, well, you could call them that still, but they do a lot more than that. But they're also cultural machines. They convey and encode our larger values. So, she's not arguing that programmers creating Unix were consciously creating some way to think about race as something that's past and box it off and move it away, put it in a black box, or consciously coding racial logics into our digital systems. Rather, she's highlighting the ways in which these systems, these histories, these internal logics, these operating systems are connected, both in computing and struggles for racial justice at the time. So the question then is, okay, maybe you buy it, maybe you don't. If you don't buy it, please give the paper a chance. There's stuff it covers that I did not for the sake of time. But how do we move forward from here, right? If we're going to face up to the problems that we're contributing to, if these modular logics are making it hard for us to address these complicated social problems, what can we do? So McPherson calls for new hybrid practices of the things that she lists. One of them is critical race theory coders, this idea that more of us need to be exploring a wider set of interdisciplinary ideas and listening and talking with people outside of our normal purview. Or maybe there's somebody who's in your everyday life who is not being listened to because of these larger systems, and centering those problems and really owning up to our role in it and trying to do something about it. So it's a nice vision for where we can go from here. But before we move on, I want to talk about how these connected operating systems are really prevalent, not just in the examples I've talked about so far. And so I'm going to talk about modularity around oppressive systems like racist logics in the law in the United States. And coincidentally, also around the mid-century. So I want to dig into another paper. This one is by Kimberly Crenshaw. It is a 1989 paper. And if you've ever heard the term intersectionality, this is the paper that is attributed with coining that particular term. And so Crenshaw is a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia, and she's looking into how creating a frame for us to think through multiple types of oppressive systems and how they interact at the same time, right? So how does racism and sexism, how do they interact? And what does that mean for people who are experiencing both of them at the same time? And so the idea is to think about a literal intersection to help make this conceptually easier. So instead of you have racism in one box and sexism in another box, and they're discrete objects, you can deal with one, deal with the other, not ever have to worry about how they overlap. That is, it doesn't work. And unfortunately, that modular logic is encoded in the law. And so part of what Crenshaw talks about is a case, DeGraffenreid versus General Motors. And this was a 1976 lawsuit where 5 black women sued General Motors because they all got fired on a last hired, first fired principle. But part of what's important to know is that General Motors didn't even hire any black women before 1970. So it's not surprising that there's this large group of people who were the last hired. Seems sort of like it might be related to some of those big social change things we were talking about in the 1960s. So these women took their case to court, and the judge dismissed it, like flat out. And here was the reasoning. General Motors still hired women. There was no discrimination case based off of women because white women were working for General Motors. So obviously GM is fine. They're not discriminating against women. And there are still black men hired by General Motors. So if you want to pursue a race-based case, you're going to have some difficulties there. But there's also some other issue that you can join some other case. But ultimately, the judge is saying to these women that they're asking for special protections, that they can't be discriminated against at the same time for being black and women. I mean, that to me is like modularity in a social system perfectly described. And so looking back on it, it's really heartbreaking to think that there just was no case, because that's not how the law was designed. You're either suffering under sexism or you're suffering under racism, but you aren't at the intersections. And so I find intersectionality to be a really helpful framing system, because it's not just one thing that we're dealing with. The modularity and the chaos of social life doesn't really work that way. And while it's complicated to grapple with all these different things, it's super important, right? Because this intersection is not too bad. It's pretty straightforward, but even this one is simple life. There's so many various modes of systemic oppression that we're all navigating through. We've got homophobia, racism, sexism, ableism, classism. There's various types of nationalism, all sorts of religious discrimination. There are so many overlaps there, right? Gender itself is a really complicated field. So many people think that there's just a gender binary. We've got just men or just women. And even that is in false logic, to put it one way. So that's a lot to take in when you're trying to figure out, okay, I want to do better. Tech shouldn't be so bad about these equity and inclusion issues, and I want to help, but where do I begin? I can get overwhelmed. We all can get really overwhelmed trying to tackle these problems. So this is where I've got good news for you. You're not alone. Look at all the coffee cups. There's so many people at the table. For me, this is where I turn to papers. I turn to words and listening to people, and there's so much inspiration to be had, so many ideas that have pointed out, like Tara McPherson does, and Kimberly Crenshaw pointing out these frameworks and connections that maybe we couldn't see without their help, and help point us towards better futures. Not perfect futures, but let's do better. We can do better, one step in front of the other, right? So what I want to do now is, I've got plenty of time, but I don't want to overwhelm, so I've got like some flyby papers that I wanted to point to in terms of people who are doing this type of work of bringing the social and the tech together and trying to help us navigate the next step forward. And it won't surprise you that I'm in HCI. A lot of these papers are from HCI, human-computer interaction. And part of the reason is, if you're looking at human-centered social problems and computing problems, looking at them both together, human-computer interaction is a pretty good fit. So even if you're not an HCI person, give it a chance as a place for inspiration, because it's a really good nexus point for these types of ideas. So this first paper I want to point everybody to is called Design Justice Towards an Intersectional Feminist Framework for Design Theory and Practice. It is by Sasha Costanza-Chalk, and they are a scholar, activist, and media maker, currently a professor of civic media at MIT, a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard as well. And this paper does a really great job of saying, okay, so you're doing the work of designing, you're sitting down and trying to think through how do you progress, and what does it mean to wrestle with all these different systems. And this is a brand new paper, came out just a few months ago, and Sasha is helping guide the way, helping us think about what are our complicities in these systems, and what does it mean to be wrestling with them. So, someone else who is doing great work is Alex Ahmed. Alex is a PhD student at Northeastern in the Personal Health Informatics program in the College of Computer and Information Science. And this paper, Transcompetent Interaction Design, a qualitative study on voice, identity, and technology, does a fabulous job of outlining how our assumptions when we're programming about gender binaries end up having really frustrating negative impacts on people. And through this interview-based study, we get to hear the voices of people who are impacted and really wrestle with the implications of that and center those voices. And Alex leaves us with some opportunities for where to move forward from here, but they're just starting points, right? All of these things are stepping stones. So you won't find exactly what to do, but when you're open to these ideas and you let them transform your thinking, who knows what we as a group can come up with when we're centering these voices. There's a lot of hopeful potential here. This next one is one of my papers. It's called Let's Talk About Race. That might be surprising based off of the rest of this talk, but it is actually different from this one. And it's about chatbots. So we start with Tay and look into the particular technical reasons why it is hard to program in a way that is responding to racism, right? So when the Tay fiasco happened, there were a lot of think pieces that came out, and some people were just like, you know what? Racism is bad design. You can fix racism in technology through designing well. And so, okay, how, right? Like that seems like a huge problem, like a huge insurmountable task. And so what would it mean to try and do better when programming an AI chatbot along these types of issues? And so in that paper, we look into sort of 3 technical contexts that are important in chatbots. We look at databases, we look at natural language processing, and we look at machine learning sort of broadly. And we map similarly to McPherson's, but in a more tech space. So this was a Chi paper. It's an ACM publication rather than a digital humanities publication. So if you're interested in this, this might be another good step in the right direction. We are trying to bring these pieces together to understand why these problems are so hard for us to address, and then say, okay, if we know the way that the technical issues are related to the social issues, we can understand why we're getting stuck, we can name the problems we're facing, and then we can try and do better. Maybe we can't have this perfect, not racist algorithm. I mean, Google 2 years later is still struggling with the gorilla thing. 2 years from now, I'd be shocked if they are. I'd be happy to be wrong, but I'd be shocked if we've progressed a lot, unless all of us start saying, you know what? Yeah, we're going to work on this now, and this is a priority. So I think these are some inspiring papers to turn to. But coming back down to the here and now, as opposed to the hopeful tomorrow, where are we now, right? Relative to that picture we started with from 1955, how far have we come? And so this got released earlier this month. I don't know if many of you saw this, but Melinda Gates' new research reveals alarming diversity numbers. And it's not just alarming diversity numbers in hiring practices and in computer science and engineering degrees. I think a lot of us know about that, but this is also looking at the spending habits of some major tech corporations. So this came out September 12th, not very long ago. And in this report, which is done in partnership with McKinsey, and it's titled Reboot Representation, they look at 32 major large tech corporations, including Google, eBay, Salesforce, some small names you might never have heard of. And they look at how much money these companies have brought in the last year. So the answer is around $500 billion in sales. They look at spending on philanthropy across these organizations. That number is a little more than 500 million on philanthropy in total in the past year by these corporations. And then they break that number down even more, and they say, okay, so these tech-related specific problems, these including equity and diversity and justice and computing, how are we doing there? And so they look at the money. It's always, a lot of people say, look at the money, right? So here's where we're at. $24 million of that $500 million on philanthropy went to programs supporting women and girls in tech. 24 million. So when we look at intersections, when we say these things aren't just modular, it's not just women and girls, how are we doing when it comes to women of color in tech? Across these 32 companies, they spent $335,000 aimed at programs for women of color. It says a lot about where we're at and what we're thinking, and if we don't expand our conversations and who we're getting inspiration from and who we're listening to and whose voices are being centered, we might not even be seeing or responding to these problems, right? That seems horrible. And how is this so many years from 1955? We can do better than this. So if you turn to papers for inspiration, this is not shocking that this is what the numbers look like. So I've got some papers if this is something you're interested in looking at. This first one is When Computers Were Women. It's by Jennifer Light. And Jennifer Light is the director of Science, Technology, and Society program at MIT. And this paper looks at the historical portrayal, or the lack thereof, of women in computer science, as well as the feminization of labor in early computing histories. And I'll say right out the bat, if there's any professors in the room, I think this particular paper belongs on computer science curriculums everywhere, undergrad, grad. It's a really accessible paper, and some people still don't know that once upon a time computers were women, right? Like, it wasn't always a machine. You used to have people sitting down and doing tabulations. Everybody, I think more people are aware of that now that we've got hidden figures, but it's important to see what happens there. And so in this paper, Light looks at pictures and promotional materials and job ads and takes a historical point of view. And you see how pictures that were in newspapers of the ENIAC system actually cropped women out. Like, historically, women were just removed from the record even at the time. So it's a great piece, highly recommend it. And it is very accessible for, I think, the audiences that you might be interacting with. So similarly, and this one comes out a little before, is another paper called The Army and the Micro World. And this one is about computers and the politics of gender identity. And so while the other one, Light's paper, is looking at feminization in women in computing, this paper speaks to the male culture of computing and the masculinization of the field. And so with these two papers, you know, not published recently, you have like a pretty good historical record of some of the labor politics, particularly along the gender lines, in computing. And it makes this headline not particularly shocking, particularly since race is barely even a part of those two papers. And if you have the framework, the ability to name problems and see them, like intersectionality, you see these gaps, you see these margins and these holes that people are falling into. And so sometimes that can make you feel kind of like this, you know, grr. Well, that's such an underwhelming, there's so much actual more anger, but you get tired, you know? It's hard to be angry all the time. You gotta live your life too, but there's a lot of anger and rightfully justified anger. So be angry, it's really important, get riled up. But don't forget, papers, lots of them. They have inspiration for us. And not just papers, but movies, music, so much art, really listening, particularly to people who are experiencing these social problems on the front lines every day. If you're listening, if you're reading, you know, paying attention to who you read, like citational practices as an academic are really important. How many people of color are you citing? How many white dudes are you citing? How many women? How many various gender identities? How many people with different, you know, abilities? There's our citational practices, our histories, the way we tell them, they're telling stories of our field. And the stories are not only a historical record, they can point towards where we're going. They point to the future. But the future's not determined yet. You know, we can change it. We hold a lot of power. We are the populace, the means of production. Go us, if we're willing and able and ready, right? So really important here is that in moving forward, we need to be open to change through self-reflection. And so I don't know how many of you took a gender and women's studies class, a philosophy class, a Chicana studies class, a critical race theory class sometime in your educational lives, or maybe even an English class, and you were like, what do I do with all this information? I'm worked up, and I don't know what to do with here. And maybe your professor said something to you like, well, you're changed now, right? You are absorbed this material, and it changes you. And you know, at some point, especially like I remember being frustrated with that, but it's correct. If you open yourself to really being moved by people's ideas, by reflecting on how they make you uncomfortable, by where you get stuck, by what you didn't know and how much you were missing, we can grow. And when we grow, we can make new choices. So, you know, there's hope. We can do better in understanding equity and inclusion and justice and centering the voices of people who are experiencing these problems every day. So I'd like to leave with a question to really, I think it's important to have an opportunity to do some self-reflection. And so I pose to you this question: how does the tech we build, how does the tech you contribute to benefit some people while further harming others? Because when we can confront our own involvement in these problems, there's a lot of potential for how we can move on from here. And so it's a reminder that in moving forward, we need to be centering the people and the intersections in our processes, right? Like, I'm happy to be here talking to you, but I am not the foremost authority on all these problems. We got to start somewhere and then keep growing from here. It's about meaningful inclusion. So, you know, I don't know if you are familiar with some of the critiques of universities and companies and how they do performative diversity. Look at all these tokens, these very particular groups of people. We've put them on all of our ads. We've got them in all of our promotional material. Look at how diverse we are. That's performative. What about meaningful inclusion? What does it mean to step back and listen, to be open? So I find that papers and music and movies and listening to the voices, particularly of people of color, of women of color, of queer women of color, of disabled people, of disabled queer women of color, absorbing and just being open to their voices and then really respecting where they come from, that's a path towards understanding what it is to have meaningful inclusion rather than performative inclusion. So, as I was saying, in our fields, we tell stories. We have historical stories, and the stories we tell through our citational practices, who we know, who we listen to, they sort of set up the future of our work, right? Adrienne Marie Brown is an awesome organizer, and she writes about, if you're thinking about the stories you tell, if you're thinking about the future, you are participating in science fiction. And it's an opportunity for us to create new futures, multiple new futures, futures that work for more people, that were envisioned by more people, not just the narrow set of people who might have written the story so far. But hopefully, we can take these types of reflections and come up with some new stories to tell about where we're going to go in tech, what it means to include people more meaningfully in our work. So that is the note I'd like to leave you on. I think the future is bright if we are open and willing to listen and to invest in making some material changes. If you are interested in this topic, I would love to keep chatting with you. I find it really exciting. I think there's a lot to dig into and getting into the particularities of tech and the particularities of social change. So I'd look forward to hearing from you, and thank you all so much.